40% are serving the need of lower income households. So based on this study, this is a housing type that's already serving the needs of your lower income community. So some more background on accessory housing or dwelling units. The city passed an ordinance in 1984 that prohibits accessory dwelling units from being built in the city. But since that time, there was a law passed by the state that says you have to allow accessory dwelling units where other residential uses are allowed. So this is something that the city will have to look at as a change in the housing element.
Can you clarify that again? What that law says?
With the city law or the state law?
State.
The state law says that unless you adopt an accessory dwelling unit ordinance that says where second units are allowed in your city, that they are allowed wherever a single family home is allowed. You can go through a process and adopt your own accessory dwelling unit ordinance that for very specific reasons says they aren't allowed in certain areas. But in general, accessory dwelling units are to be allowed wherever a single family home is allowed.
Then what's a single family home?
Just an existing home where
No, I mean,
family.
what is it if you're putting a second unit on it? It's not single family anymore,
Well, sometimes,
unless I mistake words.
Sometimes these units are built over a garage, or they're a smaller unit that's in the back of the parcel.
Right.
They can be attached to your home, but they're a unit that's separate from your primary residence.
Right.
That will have its own kitchen.
Then
its
there's
own
no
bathroom.
such thing as R1.
Well, this is what the state legislation.
No, I'm not being an attorney or something. I want to know the definition of R1.
Well,
I thought R1 meant only one resident on the property.
State has redefined what
Okay.
the term you're using, R1.
Right.
State has redefined that to not only allow your primary single-family residence that we all accept is what is allowed in the R1 zoning
Okay.
district, but in addition,
So every
each R1 lot is also allowed a granny unit, which we happen to be
That's-
calling
so
an accessory dwelling
There's
unit.
no such thing as the old R1 anymore.
It has been revised by the
It's
state.
no such thing. Okay, let's call a spade a spade. It's no longer an R1. Now R1s are really allowed R2s.
They're
What
allowed
we
to
use
have
for
a,
R2s.
This is what,
I mean, I'm not talking about
this is what
Sausalito.
Sacramento has decided.
Sacramento
this is
said that
perfect.
R1s don't exist any longer.
well, it's not necessarily an R2 because a duplex
That's
wouldn't be
true.
allowed. An accessory dwelling unit is a certain type of housing. And the background on this is, you can imagine if you have an elderly parent who you want to build a unit, you want them to live close by, not necessarily in your house, but they want to have their own unit on your property, you're allowed to build a unit, say, over your garage, attached to your house.
Which means they don't need parking. I just want to know what the
We're getting ahead of
regulations
ourselves a
of
little
this
bit. Can we?
Yeah,
I've been here a long time, I've watched this a long time.
You're asking good questions. Can you hold the question
Okay.
for a moment?
Because by the
Where was I?
time she's done, people will have gotten little pieces.
So the city conducted a survey of all property owners in 2010 and identified the preferences for accessory dwelling units in the community. And 16% of property owners said that they would be inclined to create an accessory dwelling unit if they were allowed to do that. And 20% of owners would be able to provide off-street parking for these units. And this is a major consideration in deciding how to allow accessory dwelling units in the city. So to be able to count accessory dwelling units, the city would first have to adopt regulations to allow them, because if you prohibit them, then there's no way you would be able to count capacity for future accessory dwelling units. So a big part of this strategy would be to adopt a program consistent with state law to allow accessory dwelling units in your community. So the city has come up with as a light, a medium, and a heavy approach. The light approach would allow accessory dwelling units in very select areas of the city, and that would be based on emergency vehicle access. And there would be very strict standards for each of these units. Each accessory dwelling unit would have to provide one off-street parking space, and all other development standards would need to be complied with. So the amount of building coverage that's currently allowed on the site under the existing zoning So these different approaches represent different policy considerations for the city. Under the medium approach, the city would allow accessory dwelling units in some additional zones, specific residential zones, and each unit would have to provide one off-street parking space, but there would be some exceptions. If the unit is close to, say, a bus stop or alternative transit, that parking requirement could be waived, and then certain development standards could be relaxed, such as a discount on the building coverage requirement, and perhaps a small discount on the building permit fees for your accessory dwelling unit. And then under the heavy approach, accessory dwelling units would be allowed in all residential zoning districts, and there'd be relaxed parking, so parking wouldn't be required for the unit, and accessory dwelling units under a certain size wouldn't count against that building coverage on the site. So these are three different approaches that the task force in the city that they're considering, and what that equals a different number of units that the city would be able to count against the RHNA. So under the light approach, you can see the city might be able to get credit for 13 of these units against that regional housing needs allocation, and it increases as you encourage this housing unit type more through your policies and make it easier to build. The city would be able to get more credit for these types of units. And on the scale that we created on ranking this strategy, it would be slightly an easier strategy for the city. It would be making sure that the zoning ordinance complies with state law, putting policies in place, and depending on how many units the city was trying to claim, this is a strategy that HCD is used to. A lot of other communities count the capacity for accessory dwelling units. So it would be a strategy that HCD would be open to accepting. One problem with this, though, is that the city doesn't have much of a past history of allowing accessory dwelling units because there's a city ordinance that prohibited them. And HCD a lot of times they want to know what you've done in the past to represent what you're going to do in the future. So the city will have to work with HCD if they want to pursue this strategy to show that they are really committed to creating these units that they have prohibited in the past. The second strategy that the city is considering is an accessory dwelling unit amnesty program. So as we talked about, there's a city ordinance that prohibits accessory dwelling units in the city, but there have been some units built since that time, but they would be considered illegal or non-conforming uses because they weren't issued legal building permits. So the city conducted a survey that showed that 15% of owners have an existing accessory dwelling unit on their property, and 25% of those owners indicated that it was built without permits. So these would be units that weren't legally permitted because of an ordinance that prohibited them. And 40% of owners with an existing accessory dwelling unit are able to provide off-street parking for the unit. So the accessory dwelling unit amnesty approach is to be able to count existing accessory dwelling units that already exist in the city. But because a lot of these units are illegal, they weren't necessarily counted in the US Census, in the 2000 census, or in the Department of Finance numbers that were used to create the city's projection of future need. So these are units that already exist in your community that are serving the needs of lower income residents, moderate income residents, but because they're not on the books, the city hasn't gotten credit for them. So to be able to count these units that already exist in the communities, the city would need to adopt an amnesty program to, well, first the city would have to pass regulation to allow accessory dwelling units, and then adopt an amnesty program to make those existing illegal units legally permitted units. So under the light approach, the conditions for these units would be stricter, and these are the same as the conditions that I talked about for future accessory dwelling units. So the need to provide off-street parking and comply with all development standards. Under the medium approach, parking standards might be waived, some development standards relaxed. And then under the heavy approach, parking wouldn't be required, and the accessory dwelling unit wouldn't count against the building coverage on the site. And this is a very unique strategy to Sausalito. The state has never really dealt with this strategy before, but the city has been working with HCD, with the state, to gain their acceptance of this strategy, and they have indicated a willingness to work with the city to count some of these existing units. So depending on the policies and how willing the city is to promote accessory dwelling units, the city might be able to count more of these existing units against the regional housing needs allocation. And the city has done some work to prove that many of these units were not counted in the census. And the state has indicated if you can prove that and then adopt an amnesty program, we'll work with you to be able to count some of those units. So this could be a strategy that the city could work with the state on to meet some of that remaining need. The third strategy, much like the last strategy, is to count existing undocumented liveaboards. And again, this is a very unique strategy to the city of Sausalito, something that the state hasn't really dealt with before. So the city's existing zoning ordinance allows 10% of berths to be used for liveaboards, and half of those liveaboards must be available to low and moderate income households. A 2009 survey of the boating community revealed that a majority of the liveaboards are permanent residents of their boats, that the median cost for the berth was $657, which is well below the market rate for a one-bedroom apartment. And the city's estimated that there's an estimated 116 unpermitted liveaboards in the city. And several marinas in the city, several marinas do not have city permits or the Bay Conservation and Development Commission permits for these liveaboards. So they're existing liveaboards that don't have a permit, so they're not technically considered a permanent residence. But if the city were to have an amnesty program to allow up to 10% of those boats to be considered liveaboards, then the city might be able to count some of these existing liveaboards that aren't currently legally permitted as liveaboards, could potentially count some of those against the regional housing needs allocation. So the city has done the math and identified that they could count up to 92 existing unpermitted liveaboards as affordable housing if the city can prove that they weren't all counted in the 2000 census. So under this approach, the city could legalize up to 10% of unpermitted liveaboards at the marinas with these unpermitted units through an amnesty program. And the city has done some research already to prove that these liveaboards were not counted in the 2000 census. And the light, medium, and heavy approach, so these are different assumptions for assuming the income split of these existing liveaboards. So under the light approach, the city would require that there be an even split between the income levels for these through this amnesty program. Under the medium approach, there'd be more of an emphasis on the very low, low, and moderate income levels for these for permitting these existing liveaboards. And then under the heavy approach, there'd be more of an emphasis on very low and low income units. And there would be a larger incentive for lower income liveaboards. So this is the breakdown of numbers under the light, medium, and heavy approach. So the city is considering under this amnesty program how much to encourage these future liveaboards to be lower income units. And HCD has indicated a willingness to accept some of these existing liveaboards as long as they're part of a larger strategy and the city's not relying too heavily on counting units that already exist. But they have